There we go.
There we go.
All right, this is Andrew Middleton, and he is a high school special education teacher who has also taught in other levels. And I am going to interview him today with a group of questions that we have put together. So, Andrew, Number one, how do you create physical or virtual learning environments that promote student learning, reflect diversity, and encourage constructive and productive interactions among students?
Wow, that's a big one. So are you talking about like the physical workspace or just the overall classroom environment?
Just the overall classroom environment.
I think number one, it comes with rapport, but it starts with, you know, your willingness as a teacher to be open and vulnerable and let your students know and see that you're not perfect, but you have command over your emotions and your ability to troubleshoot. You know, as teachers, we're not just instructors of like content, right? We're instructors of like social emotional development, and we're instructors of behavioral components and how to react in stressful circumstances. And in a classroom like mine, you know, that comes from your ability to connect with students, but the way that they connect with you is to see like the real you, not the one that you think they want to see. You need to be authentic. You need to be willing to take chances. You need to be the first person to stick up for them when they're in a jam or they're in trouble. You need to be the person that's in their corner, you know, willing to go the extra mile. We can never expect students, and my philosophy is you can never expect students to walk into your classroom and automatically turn on the respect switch because you're the teacher. And that worked, you know, in Laura Ingalls Wilder, Little House on the Prairie. Like today, in our world, and with social media and in our classroom that I work in, self-advocacy being the most important thing, students need to see how it's used appropriately first. You have to be the one to do that. You also have to find a way to like connect with kids. And so that's why being vulnerable is the best, and being honest and having conversations and creating a place where they feel like they can communicate. Something that I've never really done, but I did this year in a virtual environment and I'll do when we go back to school, which we're actually going to be able to do, is create a culture wall and have students bring in pieces of their own identity and their own culture. Whether, you know, coming from middle school to high school, it's very different because in my classroom, my demographic is so diverse. I have students of color. I have students part of the LGBTQ community. I have 2 students transitioning, dealing with gender dysphoria. I have students that are dealing with severe mental health issues, and they need to feel like when they walk into the classroom, they see their stamp on the wall and in the virtual environment too. So one way I did that for the virtual environment was like put a bulletin board behind me, and that became my backdrop. And then students told me what to put up there, and we're building it throughout the trimester of things that represent their culture. And once we create that, we start to identify with that. And I ask students to tell us what we need to add to the wall that would amplify our culture. So it's really about getting students to create the space. You're just guiding them, but they need to be a part of making it. You know, it's your room as a teacher, but it's temporarily your room because for the majority of the day, you are outnumbered. Your students are there, and you need to give them the opportunity to develop in that space that they have created for themselves. It'll be much more productive for them. So those are a few ways that
that's what we had talked about too, is like building a sense of community. And what is that, you know, a community is important for everybody to feel like they belong. So why is it different in a classroom?
You know, it's real. I think it's the most important piece, right? I mean, you've had experience working with students similarly that, you know, that I'm working with now in your history within the Powell Unified School District. And I think the number one thing that makes you successful as a person instructing children is your ability to create an environment that they trust you in. How many times have we seen teachers come in and demand respect and subs, right? They think that that's that fallback, right? That sub is going to come in and they're going to respect me because I'm standing in the front and I'm going to do, yeah, that's great for maybe the white kids in class if you're a white person. But what about your children of color who don't respond to that type of authority, especially in our political climate today where trust is not there? You have to build it from the ground up. You got to lay that solid foundation of trust, and it has to be the teacher willing to go and make the mistake first and be there to catch the kid before they fall. That's essentially it.
Yeah. Perfect. Number 2, on a day-to-day basis, how do you address the needs of English learners and students with special needs to provide equitable access to students? You being in special education, this is one that we battle back and forth with all the time.
With what? Just like,
well, how gen ed teachers approach this versus this is, normal for us. We're always trying to figure out and providing equitable access to all students because that's what we do in special education. But
I mean, I just think that like we need to start looking at each individual student as an individual, right? That's why in special education, we have that individualized education plan. We have this, we're all a function of the general education environment, right? But then the IEP is there in specific classroom settings is there to level the playing field. Oh God, it's tricky because like when you're working in that general education environment, most teachers go through a program in a credential setting and they don't have the training or experience that you or I would have working in the environments that we see. They see an IEP once, they get a class, you have a classroom full of students that you may have 3 or 4 IEPs in there, and you kind of just get comfortable with this one size fits all type of learning. And you think that like if you bring in computers once a week in a lesson, or you do this once a week or a lesson, or you have a word wall, that's going to be sufficient to teach students with special needs or English language learners. And in my experience, 1 day a week is not enough on even a fractal scale. Like you need to be using opportunity, Google Read and Write is something that students should have access to every single day. We're all still developing readers. So giving students an opportunity to hear something pronounced correctly, or giving students access to more, just like splitting up a test that, is crammed onto 2 pages over 6 pages. It's a very simple thing to do, but most gen ed teachers don't want to do it because it's that one student that frustrates them because it's like, well, now I got to change this and I got to create a new format. And I'm not saying that's every teacher, but in my experience, when it comes to things like that, it's like, well, it's just one kid and they need to learn how to do this, right? There's that attitude and idea, and that's just not fair. I think we need to think equitably across the board. Like each person needs a different height of a box to stare over the same height fence. And so one group may need additional phonemic spelling on a spelling or on a reading assessment when they're working with vocabulary words with a picture so they know what it's looking like attached to some type of, in your credential program, it's a big word, realia, right? When we're talking about real things that we can manipulate. It's that awareness piece. But I think too, it goes back to the respect for the student. How often, and you got to check yourself as a teacher, like, how often do we sit there trying to put something together and get mad at the person who created these instructions? Well, they weren't thinking of me because I'm a visual learner with an auditory learner and I need these motor opportunities as well. And I'm just going to go watch a YouTube video to do this because somebody else did it. And that's the stimulus that I need. It's no different when we're putting together lessons for learning that like 1% of your classroom is going to get it the way that you created it. The rest of your students are going to need that. So you got to be aware, what technology can you bring in? What graph paper can you bring in? What are things that are going to be beneficial for that student that all students would benefit from?
I think too, it goes along with constantly educating yourself as an educator. What can I learn to keep helping these kids? And if this doesn't work the first time, what else can I present and put out there? So you're always your wheels are having to turn, which and then causes you to have to learn what else is out there because it changes. The things that are provided and available for tools and supports these days are far different than what was out there 20 years ago. Far different than what was 5 years ago.
Yeah. Well, look at the environment that I'm teaching in now, right? Like, how many years have I been in a classroom setting? Last year, because of COVID, we go into what we call distance learning. And in 3 weeks, I needed to create something for students with some severe learning disabilities in an environment that is not conducive, because they required that like support with you there to physically model it with them, and sometimes place their hand in the correct place to get them started. So there's all of these components that we have to think of. We got to think about the whole child all the time. And, I think a common misconception too is when we see this, and I see this when I've worked with, young teachers and, myself, I get caught up in this too, because I've been in this for a while, I have to remind myself that, you still think that if you think that you're providing the correct supports and lessons still aren't going through, and this is social emotional supports as well, social emotional development at all grade levels. I've learned 2 things in education. The first day of school, students show up. The next day, it's all going to change. It doesn't, those are the only 2 constants. And that's just the way it is. So if you're not willing to change, and you're not willing to reflect, and you're not willing to go through, it's going to create an issue. And that's what I think that teachers need to get in a habit of, is being comfortable with accepting change and knowing that, like, yes, you developed a really rad lesson that you continue to use, but you developed it 10 years ago.
Yeah.
What does your class now need? And what are their needs? What needs are going to make this lesson even better for everybody else? So that's kind of what I've always tried to do. And I constantly fail at it. I throw shit away all the time. Like, I threw away something, and we're only 8 days into the school year, and I chucked something on Thursday, and I was like, I'm not testing you next week. I screwed this up. So
that kind of goes into the next question of how much do you want to know about your students in order to be most helpful to them? So like
everything.
How far do you dig in to, get to know your students but it's something that you're always learning, it's not, you're not going to know on the first day of school because they filled out an about me, everything about them.
Yeah. No.
So all that goes in with complete change.
Right. And that's surface culture, right? That's surface needs. That's the stuff that you can see that you think you're addressing their needs. So many times we have students that they're smart enough to do it. They haven't eaten in 5 days.
Yeah.
Right. So it's like, you get choked up thinking about it. I'm starting to think about a student that we, shared in the class. It's like, those students that go home to frustration and anger from a parent and McDonald's every night, or no food, or students that we've had that go home every night and eat out of vending machines or sleeping in their car until a teacher finds out and can have an honest conversation. It's like, if you think you're helping them just by giving an about me, you are sadly mistaken. And your students deserve more. They deserve more teachers to be less afraid of what society tells them is okay to do as a teacher. You need to go out there and you need to be brave. You need to get to know the kids. The about me is great to start the first 5 days of school.
Yeah.
After that, get serious with conversations.
Yeah.
Build relationships. Get them to trust you. Ask them why they're sad. Tell them that you know. Tell them that it's okay. Tell them that it's not fair. Tell them that you're there to help them. But the most important thing you have to do when you do all that is follow through. Let them know, like, the action, so they see that you actually came through. If you say you're going to bring pizza on a Friday, bring pizza on a Friday.
Yeah.
And if you say that you're, going to give 5 extra credit points on a test, give 5 extra credit points. If you forget and the kid reminds you, boom, say, oh my God, thank you so much for reminding me. You are so correct. Here's your 5 points. Show everybody that you give 5 points. That right there creates so much willingness for a student to try again, but it also creates the willingness for them to open up because they trust you.
Yeah, it's funny because you're literally leading yourself right into the next question. You're talking about extra credit and bringing in pizza and stuff, and it's like, how do you motivate or encourage your students to learn? And, obviously trust is one thing, because if they trust you and they like you, they're going to want to learn and continue going. But you know,
Mhm.
you talked about extra credit, and you talked about, you know, bringing in pizza and, you know,
Those
giving
things
a
are great.
little,
I also think it's like designing learning opportunities that they find success in,
mhm,
right? So at least for like 60 to 70% of your learning opportunity for the day or your unit, you would want them to be able to do that independently as much as they can. But you also want to challenge them. And that's the key piece, right? They need to find success. If they constantly come in and see the same difficult assignment every single day and they can't do it, what are they going to want to do?
yeah,
Right? You need to give them those breadcrumbs. You need to give them those opportunities for frequent positive praise. You know, you need to give them that opportunity to find success. There is not a person in this world who loves going to a job or a place they find no success in.
mhm,
And it doesn't need to be anything that's told to them that they're being successful. It's that observable success, right?
yeah,
You know, and that's that piece that's key. It's like kids gotta be able to feel like they're learning there, and that you're addressing their needs. Sorry, my kid's coming in and she's not wearing any pants today, so I don't think we want that on the interview.
um, how does your classroom reflect kindness, patience, and a safe space?
I mean, those. I mean, I established that with the teachers and the people that I work with on a daily basis. Just as that's the number one. That like that's what we do. We treat kids that way. That there's going to be no misinformation or miscommunication about that. Everybody that comes into the classroom gets treated with a 10 to none, 10 positives to nothing negative. You know, and know that like there's no one person more frustrated in that environment than the student,
Mhm,
because for their entire I teach 9th, 10th, 11th, and 12th graders now. So for their entire academic careers, they have found no success. I'm the most restricted program in my district, the most restricted program, and they've not found success in any other program. Why continue to show up?
yeah,
You know what I mean? If you're only going to hear that you are the worst thing, and they're aware that they're in the most restricted program because they're so socially available to the world around them. So the number one thing that they got to know is the first moment that they walk in, it's all about them, and it's going to be 10 to none. There's going to be accountability though. Like, yes, it's all great to do roses and sunshine, but I also think students, in my experience, all areas from high achieving to the students that I teach with right now, is when you establish respect, rapport, routine, and accountability and get kids to follow through and you hold them to that expectation,
mhm,
that also is a lot more of a way than bringing in Domino's pizza on a Friday because you promised them.
yeah,
You know, I mean, it's just, we can't just think that a reward box is always going to do it too. Those are fantastic pieces to have in a classroom for sure. You know, they're different in high school. You know, we have opportunities to go to the vending machine or, you know, order in lunch or different things like that. But when it gets down to it, and this is from what I learned in my experience inside juvenile hall, is those kids that are dealing with those things are struggling and have never had that. So if you can create that and they know that you've got their back socially, emotionally, behaviorally, and academically because you're holding them accountable and helping them learn that skill, man, they'll be there for you 100-fold.
yeah,
And I've seen it. It's a wonderful thing. And then the kids buy into it, and that's when you know they're doing it on their own. And that's when you know the most important lesson they learned is the ability to advocate and take care of themselves and follow through on their own accord.
mhm,
That's when you know you're successful. I can teach a kid how to read, I can teach a kid how to use it, but if I can teach a kid how to become socially and emotionally and behaviorally aware and begin to use these accountability pieces to like be successful, then I've done my job.
yeah. Let me see. How do you balance your responsibilities as a teacher with your everyday home life?
Jeez, man, I don't think. I mean, it's a struggle because like we're not in an industry where you leave at 3:30 or you leave at 5, right? You know, you go home thinking about kids that are homeless. You go home and you carry it there, and you go home to a place and a thing that you create for your family. I've struggled with that. Like there's been times that I've dedicated way too much to the career and I left at like 6 or 7 o'clock at night and wake up and get back in there at 6 o'clock in the morning. I'm now starting to realize that I need to have a balance, because in special education, you get really tired really quick.
Well, it's
And
never ending. There's always something.
yeah. And so I've found that like I have to take the weekends. I don't work on the weekends anymore. Emails can wait until Monday. I'm not going to be able to get them the answers on a Saturday or Sunday anyways. I'm not going to have access to a principal or a counselor or whoever. It is what it is. And I just take that time over the weekends. I also like, finding interests, making sure that you continue to take care of those interests. But I also have had to check myself and make sure that I'm like dedicating that time to my own personal children, because I need, realistically, in the grand scheme of things, your family is more important than the work world. Your kids are going to be there that they know that you're there, and if you're doing your job, they're going to come back and they're going to be there for you. And if you're building that rapport, it's great. But the risk of losing your family is not worth that 6-7 o'clock night every day. So you just have to check yourself. You got to catch in. You got to pay attention, and it's very hard to. It takes people to tell you.
Yeah. Next one. What do you do to set your classroom up to allow kids to feel successful?
Oh man, I let them bring this in the physical classroom. Yeah, I let them. I mean, first of all, we create the environment. Like I let them now come in and be part of the environment, planning it, talking about it, giving them an opportunity to see themselves. However, and working with, in my class and the classrooms I've been in with support staff, getting an idea of like what students work best in what space, and then desk areas and arrangement, how is that going to flow? Because some students might not work great at a round table. Some students may work it better at an independent station. So it's like, you've got to take all those things into consideration, and group students that are kind of working at the same skill level, but can like help each other in a different way, build on a skill that they might not already have, while another student at that group has mastered it. So, it's always evolving. Something that I, didn't really do much of, until working with you, is like changing it more frequently, getting kids the opportunity. I think the biggest thing for me was 2 years too late when I finally got the dry erase board tables, after like fighting for those things for like 2 years. But the moment those things came in, it became something new and something rad and something fun, and kids could actually, manipulate their workspace, and it became engaging, and it no longer became, oh, we have to do this activity on a pencil and a paper. We can use the desk, wipe it off, and if I hated it, I don't have a hard copy of it. It's gone. I erased it. There's something symbolic about it. I wish I could have taken those desks with me to, my new classroom, and God, I tried, but it just didn't work out. But I mean, thinking about the physical space that kids can work in, understanding that there's some kids that don't like to be crowded, and maybe 2 at a desk or 2 at a table is fine, and being comfortable with the fact that that's okay. And if a kid asks for it, get it to them. But remember that the goal there is to remind that student that we're going to add somebody else here in like 2 or 3 weeks. So be ready for that.
What are your thoughts about standardized testing, and do you feel that it's a good way to measure student progress as a whole?
Not at all. I think it's just there for APY scores and new schools to, boost property value. I think as a special education teacher, I think it's grossly implemented to student populations that are not able to take that test simply due to disability, learning disabilities, physical disabilities. As much as they say it's inclusive testing, it's a lie. I'm not a fan of standardized testing. If you mean to tell me that in one test at the end of the year, we'll be able to tell you what students in my classroom have mastered over my experience with those students over 180 days, you and I are going to have a difficult discussion, because that is not an accurate way to measure. I don't believe in that. I don't think that that's the way that we measure success in the real world. Why do we measure that success in the classroom and put it on, the shoulders of a 5-year-old, a 6-year-old, a 7-year-old, an 8-year-old, a child who's developing the earliest stages of schizophrenia and anxiety and depression, and a test like this where they're socially aware of like, oh my God, it's going to hurt my parents' property value. And they start to slide down that slippery slope and they psych themselves out of taking that test. And it creates more problems. It's just ridiculous, and not to mention the accommodations that we write in IEPs aren't always seen on that test. And then when we go to say that they need to implement it, we're told by our site admin, that's our testing coordinator, that we're not able to implement those things. And I'm like, then why are we able to write it in an IEP? This is what they need. Well, we don't have a way to control that. Well, then we shouldn't be giving this assessment. If we haven't looked at every possible function, and that's what your job is for 6 months until we take that test, to make sure that these accommodations in this IEP are within this testing format, then it doesn't make any sense.
Yeah.
Also, too, I think it's a joke because I've had experiences at times where, students with special needs take that test, but then are omitted. So for the ones that really think it's important and want to try it, well, they have an IEP and they may have, low cognition or they're on the autism spectrum, and people, and I'm not saying all educators are all people or all community members, but there are those that remove scores because they overgeneralize the term autism and they think that that's somebody that's critically impaired and can't hold a pencil and uses a device to talk with like four words.
Yeah.
And so they remove all students with autism, or they say, I've had them say in front of, Middleton's class, we just aren't going to put them in here because, they don't test well. And I'm like, that's despicable. Like you basically said that they didn't matter. Either we all go down with the ship or we all, get there successfully. And so that's why I don't think that it's appropriate or fair. I don't think it's implemented well. I don't think it's been put together well. I don't think it levels the playing field. And I think it's an inaccurate measure of student success. Because the way they take that test is not how we teach in high school and middle school.
Well, it's not how you teach, period.
No. I mean, I don't go in there, and it's so funny, like when we start to see Common Core standards at times align with like the annotations and the marking up your text, because when they take those standardized tests and you have like 6 questions on one side, but 20 paragraphs to read on the left, and here comes your annotation skills. What's the percentage of students that can accurately annotate that text the way it needs to be done to answer all of those and create a linear model of a synthesized text?
Yeah.
2-3% of your student population on campus, which are the higher achieving anyways, which is probably your 2 gate classes on campus. Forget that. Like it doesn't, I could go on for days about that. I hate it. If I wasn't going to get fired for telling parents to opt out, I would tell them to opt out.
I couldn't agree more as a parent and staff. Last one and we'll wrap it up. Do you find it difficult sharing new information or tools used in and out of the classroom with more seasoned staff? So obviously as we go along, we learn new things, we take professional developments, we take classes on our own, and then, why hoard the knowledge? Let's go out and share it. But when you go to share it with certain people who are a little more stubborn in their ways because they've been doing it for so long, what's your experiences with that?
Well, it just depends on kind of like who you're talking to, right? Because you get to know your tribes on the school site and you know who's going to be willing. I also think it's a way that you present that information. In my experience, it's been fairly good. I've pulled the right teachers at the right schools. When I was at Oak Valley, I had the luxury of choosing what teachers' classrooms students would go into, and I would have personal conversations because I knew that they would be open to some of the new learning. You have a very large group still of teachers that are stuck in, the older way of learning and the older way of educating. Now, that doesn't mean they don't care about their students or kids. They're just unwilling to see that our student population is not the same as it once was when they got their credential in the 70s and were successful in the 80s. And that's, I think, the hard part. I think I mean, I have had teachers tell me to stay in my lane, that I didn't know what I was talking about when it comes to working with students with behavior. And I've had to remind them that's all I do, is work with students with behavior. I mean, you and I have built program where parents would fight to come to the classroom we've created because they knew that their child's needs would be met in that situation. And we would do everything we could in the environments in the general education classroom to be successful. But that's because we handpicked those teachers. Yeah. Think about those, that's the good piece. Now, it is sad when you come back with a lot of wonderful learning and you come back with a lot of things and you share it and teachers say it's okay. But the majority of the answer back was like, well, we just don't have the time to do that now. So we'll put it off until next year.
Yeah.
And you're like, that doesn't, it's gonna, but it can work now.
Yeah. Why not change it now?
Why not change it now? Yeah. So other than that, it's pretty good. I'd like to think now that in, the year 2020, as much as COVID sucks, I think because we've all had to rally together at school sites to get our technology things taken care of, work together to build MyConnect sites that students can access, find ways to create engaging learning opportunities. I would say more teachers are flexible and asking for help now than I've ever seen in my career in education. Yeah. Typically at the start of the year, you have teachers that are saying, those teachers that are asking for help now are saying, this will never work. You guys don't know what you're talking about. I've been doing this for 40 years and it's just going to be a cycle, and they're unwilling to change. Now that they've been forced to change, it's amazing what their outlook becomes. And so it's been kind of cool, but
I agree. And I think it, like you said, it definitely depends on, you get to know who is, working around you and who you're working with. And, typically who's going to accept that change or recommendation or, wow, this is what I just learned and I think it would be really cool for X amount of students. But then you're going to have the other ones who are, no, thank you. This is how I run my classroom because I've been doing it for 25 years and, it's the same and it works. That doesn't really work.
And if you go back to the line of questions that you asked, it's those same teachers that you can go through and like clockwork know what they're studying, and you can look back and they're making copies on probably the same original document that they made 20 years ago. And so that tells you something about the person that you're working with. I also think too, though, that the biggest change that a teacher can make, especially working with students with special needs in mind, isn't telling them what they need to do, is like, how can I help you work with this student in the environment that you're at? Yeah. And I think that if you can do that and show the positives and help them become independent when it's working with that student to experience it. I mean, we could think of like two students that would go to GTT, right? And one young lady, I don't want to say names because I don't know how serious this is, but like one young lady who tells it how it is, student, cut and dry. If it were a dull spoon, she would still find a way to scoop it a little bit harder. And then we had another student who was just so happy to be there, but because he was so happy to be there, wouldn't do anything. And he talked about the same thing over and over again. And that teacher that we worked with was so nervous and unwilling. But through utilizing appropriate staff on site that we had that had rapport with both of those kids, helping the teacher understand what we're there to do and what you need to meet first, and say, this is what we're going to do to help you and follow through. That teacher now is like, yo, I need students from your class because it makes me feel successful. It makes me feel good. They feel good. And so it's like, you can't expect a teacher to have the tools until you arm them with them. So that's kind of the piece. But, we just do what we do.
Yeah, exactly. And what I heard you say throughout the whole thing was pretty much emphasized of building a sense of community and trust, building that rapport. And then, just being flexible and constantly learning. And I think that's something that, we all kind of see and hopefully can continue through with, because I know I've recognized that in the last couple of years as something that, you're never done learning.
No, but I think that's something that you do really well, is you're constantly there to push that envelope. And I think I was at a place in my career where, like, when you came in and you started to do that, where it was like, whew, the 5 years hit. They weren't lying about that, right? But like, it goes in waves. I was going into my 10th year, but like there was this 5-year span. It was like, I looked back, I was like, I was excited when I left the hall and I came to Oak Valley and I had it. But then the IEPs, the district, the things, the minutia starts to weigh on you. And then a new wave or a breath of fresh air comes in. You're like, oh, all right, it's cool. Yeah,
Yeah,
I forgot
can
why
do
I'm here.
this.
I do need to challenge it. So it's like
Yeah.
that piece is great, and be open to that.
Well, cool. Well, thank you so much for your time. I highly appreciate it.
Always. Thank you.
All right.